All right, we're just going to jump right into the questions.
Great.
Here at the Southern California Reformed Baptist Pastors Conference, Dr. James Dolezal, and we've been invigorated with the majesty and mystery of God, the things that we can know about God and the things we definitely can know are not what God is about.
Yeah.
And in listening to the lecture so far, the simple conclusion that I've come to is the question, can God be God and not God at the same time? Is that a fair simplification of simplicity?
Yeah, it is a fair simplification of it, and that's, I mean, the attempt is we want to make the doctrine accessible. I would say this, and I've said this in some of the talks, that I believe that the doctrine of simplicity is at a really basic and almost instinctive level already the commitment of most Christians. Because if we were to ask most Christians, do you believe that something that is not God makes God to be what he is? They might think that's a strange way of putting it, but they would pause for a moment. And I think that most Christians would say, if I had to answer, I would say that something not God doesn't make God to be God. Well, that baseline commitment, which I think that's not a Reformed conviction in particular. That is a basic Christian conviction. When you begin to articulate that and formulate that, then you come to the doctrine of simplicity, which is really an elaboration of that basic conviction that there's nothing not God that is back of God, explaining him or making him to be. Now, the follow-up to that is, well, what does that mean? It means at the very base line that he is without parts, and that's how our old confessions put it. But what are parts? That becomes the question. And I would say parts are anything that is in a whole without which that is less than the whole, but without which the whole that is made of them would be somehow really different than it is. Parts give actuality of being to a complete composite thing, but the parts are not equal to or actually identical with the whole, and the whole depends upon its parts. I think even at that level, I think that most Christians would say, yes, that seems to be an adequate way of saying God cannot be in virtue of that which is not God, which was our basic commitment to begin with. Now, working out the implications of that, working out all the implications of saying that God is without parts, how we understand God's relationship to his own attributes. Are his attributes just a set of great making principles that all cobbled together? The sum total is God? Well, no, that couldn't be, because then you have God dependent on something less than the totality of his divinity to even just be his divinity. So we did get into some of these things. I think it's a doctrine that, again, the basic commitment is just a piece of being Christian, that God is not dependent on something not God to be in any sense. Working that out into detail does take some work, but historically it's been work that the church has been willing to undertake and to develop.
So now, as I listen to you talk about this, using language, and God's blessed us with language to be able to communicate and understand, we're also bound by language, and one of the things that you mentioned earlier was the linchpin of our difficulty with this doctrine is language, because we can speak truly of God, but we can't speak simply about God.
Right.
And as I hear you speak about God, it's heady, it's somewhat challenging, but we should expect that to be the case.
Yeah, there's a great statement. I read this in an article, I think, summarizing something from C.S. Lewis, where the author said, "It would indeed be strange if God were not strange." If God were easily explained, that would be the odd thing. When it comes to language, there's a particular challenge because, as you've already observed, we don't really have a simple way of describing a simple God. I teach undergraduate students, and I invariably get some wiseacre who says, Dr. Dolezal, how come the doctrine of simplicity isn't simple? Why is it so difficult to both understand and even articulate? And the reality is that while we can believe and confess that God is simple, we cannot comprehend simplicity. I can say that all that is in God is God, and I can say that in God the attributes of God, his wisdom, his goodness, his power, his justice, his love, are really just nothing but the divine nature itself. But the way that I speak and the way language functions, I pick out a whole series or a set of attributes: goodness, wisdom, power, love, justice. But I don't mean that my language sort of maps or mirrors a collection of properties that summatively yield God. In other words, there is a kind of unshakable non-symmetry between my statements about God, which are always composite, subject plus predicate type statements, and the way God is in himself. So when I say that God is simple and argue for God's simplicity, I do not at all intend to convey that I comprehend simplicity. In fact, I can't speak about simplicity except in complex ways.
Now, as you've studied this historically, traditionally, even in the contemporary aspect of it, do you think the more dangerous situations come from those who explicitly deny God's immutability, or those who claim to hold to God's immutability but then describe it in some mutable way?
I think that's a concern. If God doesn't change, then what we mean by that is that God does not cease to be all that he is. He doesn't, in technical terms, lose some actuality of his being. Nor does God begin to be what he was not. Now, if he's simple, that must necessarily be the case, because a simple God who doesn't have bits of him that he became or bits of him that he loses, because there are no bits, as it were, a simple God must necessarily be immutable. The struggle is, there is a trend nowadays to try to say, well, I believe that God is immutable. I don't want to stop saying that he's immutable, but I also want to say that Scripture represents God to us as changing his dealings with us. At one moment, we're under his wrath. At another, he is displaying and manifesting his grace to us and dealing with us as sons and with tenderness. And there's this urge to say, somehow, if God's going to change his dealings with me, there's going to have to be some kind of intrinsic change in God corresponding to the changing of his dealings with me. And so that sets up a motive to say, well, I still want to say God is immutable. I also want to find some way to say he's mutable, because wouldn't he have to be in order to change his dealings with me? Mm-hmm. But if you go that route, if you want to say there's something in God that doesn't change, usually people say his nature or his essence, and then something else in God that does change, his emotive dispositions or something like that, then what you're going to have to say is some things in God just are his divinity, and other aspects of his being are features of actuality that he takes on in addition to his divinity. And then you have left the doctrine of divine simplicity, because you have a composition, and the older authors would have said, you have a composition between substance and accidents. You have what is necessary to God's essence, and then you have these other features of his being that he takes on in addition to his essence, and that these are, some theologians will say all of these things are just real in God. So God really is a composite of essential features and non-essential features.
So part of God is God, part of God is not God.
That's
Can
the
God be God
yes,
and not
because
God
that's the problem. Exactly the problem. If you say that there are actualities of any sort in God, like emotive dispositions or feelings or what have you, and that these are not identical with his essence, you're going to have to explain how God can be, because every accident is a determination of being. It's a way of existing. You're going to have to account for how God can be in virtue of something that is not itself God. Those accounts, those properties or attributes or whatever you want to call them, these are parts, as it were. These are less than the whole. There's something other than the whole that are contributing some kind of existential quality to God. Some say, well, yeah, but that's okay as long as God is the one controlling these changes or these non-essential bits that he takes on. And my argument is that amounts to saying that God can will to be not God in some respects. And I think while simplicity is a strange doctrine, it's an even stranger doctrine to say that there are realities in God that are not God.
So to say that God can control God is not orthodox.
It's interesting, because it sounds wrong on the face of it. To say that God is not self-controlled well, what could the alternative be?
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be some kind of chaos,
Right.
some kind of lack of control. And in fact, it's interesting, in the older writers, the alternative to self-control was not lack of control. The alternative to self-control would be pure actuality. In other words, if God is self-controlled, we have to ask the principle, what is being controlled and what is controlling?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer inevitably is going to come up. His will is controlling other features of his being. But that presupposes that his will is somehow something other than, more basic than his essence as such, some part or component, some principle of power that actually exercises dominion over other parts of God's being. So his will now sort of controls his power or controls his love.
Internal causality is happening within God's
Absolutely.
nature.
God is, and those that are more honest with that will say, yes, we are arguing for some kind of self-creativity.
Now, in the struggle between immutability, but describing it in a mutable way, do you think that one of the common errors comes down to misidentifying the pure act of God with the effects that come from the pure act? I've heard you before mention there's no passive potency in God, that he's pure act,
right.
And that often we look at the effects and confuse those with the fact that he doesn't change, he's pure act.
The Puritan writer Edward Lee makes a distinction between the act of God, by which he means his intrinsic will, which is an effectual will. It's not just a plan. It's actually the power of God. Just is his willing. He makes a distinction between the act of God intrinsically, what we may say in Latin, the actus, and the things produced. That is to say, God's work is immutable in himself, but his work, the thing he produces, is mutable. And in Latin, the distinction would be between God's actus, his intrinsic act of being, and God's opus, that is to say, the work, the thing made. The mutability is in the thing made, and the change is perhaps in the way in which the making unfolds over time, but the act of God by virtue of which he makes is nothing but his own eternal and changing will. So that the change is in the thing made, not in the maker who is making or producing the world.
So when someone sees the effects, they can extrapolate wrongly back to God's nature and assign it aspects that don't belong to it.
Like you and I are agents in time, and when we produce events in time, the production of events in time tends to correspond to some change in us. If I go out and mow my lawn, I become intrinsically the lawn mower that I wasn't before that. In other words, my act, my opus, my production of mowing my lawn corresponds to a new activity in me. Earlier in the day when I'm sleeping on the couch, I am not actually a lawnmower. I'm only potentially a lawnmower. And then my wife says, "Hey, the lawn needs mowing. It's time to get out there." And I've got to actuate that passive potency. The potential to be lawnmower now needs to become the actuality of lawnmower. And in becoming the actual agent, I produce a temporal effect. So you could say that my being lawnmower does correspond in a one-to-one way to the thing that I do, mowing my lawn. But in God's act of production and God's act of producing temporal effects is itself an eternal act. It's nothing but his own eternal will. So if we can put it this way, God unchangingly and immutably wills the changes and mutability of creation. But we don't want to read off the mutability of his dealings or his revelation in time and in history. We don't want to read off of that and say that must mean there's a mutability in God himself, as if God is related to his works the same way you and I are related to our works.
Now, let's close with this, because I think this is a good way to sum it up. You mentioned that theological mysteries are not for reconciling, but rather for identifying, naming, and adoring. I thought that was wonderful, and that's really where we leave it, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's an important point. We don't invoke mystery merely at the end of our theology. We believe from the very beginning that we're dealing with mystery. There's a statement from Charles Journet where he says that when the theologian encounters mystery, his job is to do away with all statements that would diminish mystery. And a lot of what we're doing here, even talking about simplicity or impassibility or these other classical doctrines, is we are not so much dispelling mystery as much as we are claiming mystery, as much as we are identifying mystery. In fact, the more I study, there's a sense in which I feel that I comprehend less. There's a sense in which God seems both at one and the same time more known to me and more mysterious to me, and it doesn't lead me into a kind of mysticism, but it leads me into what John Owen calls an adoration. He says, he speaks about God's eternity, and he says, "I cannot conceive what I have said, but I do adore." And I think that's the key with theological mysteries. In Scripture, theological mystery is not a problem to be solved. It is a truth. It is a truth to be adored and loved. And that's so when David says that such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too high, I cannot attain it. He's not saying, and I wish I could. What he's really saying is, God, you're beyond all thought. Your ways are not my ways. Your thoughts are not my thoughts. And I love you for that.
Truly a blessing. Thanks for being the keynote speaker this year at the conference.
Joy
Thank
to
you
be
again,
here.
Dr. Dolezal.
Thank you very much.